Welcome to section 2 of chapter 1. Chapter 1, we are talking about computation and numbers. And this is lesson 4. And we are going to look at decimal places. So we have been rounding off numbers. So similar to rounding off numbers to the nearest 10, to the nearest 100, 1,000, etc., etc. You can also round numbers to the nearest decimal place. And of course, as it suggests, you are looking at numbers after the point. So if you have to round off to 1 dp, that's a short way of saying decimal place. If you have to round to 1 dp, that means your answer would only include 1 digit after the point. And that is another way of saying that is to round it off to the nearest 1/10 or 10, right? And that is rounding it off to the nearest decimal place. So let's look at our examples here. Just give you a little time there to look at your example and then take it in, right? So in our example, we have 2 things that we have to do. The first one is to round off to 1 decimal place or decimal point. And the second one is to round off to 2 decimal places. So let's do this as an example, similar to how we would have done it. And rounding it off to the nearest 10, 100, etc., etc. And there's 10, 100, 1,000, etc., etc. Okay. So the first one says 5.64 to the nearest 1 dp. So let's look at that. 5.64. So to the nearest, so to 1 dp, right? To 1 dp. So that means we are rounding it off, and this is the number that we would stop at. It should have 1 number after the decimal point. And just like before, we have to look at the number before. And that is less than 5, so therefore this remains 6. So the answer is 5.6. You would notice that I did not fill in the 4 with zeros. And that's because after the decimal point, that 4 does not, if I put a 0 here, that does not change this number from being 5.6, right? So that's a little different than when we did the 10s, the 100s, the 1s, and so on, right? The 1,000s, etc. Because when we were doing, let's say this was 564, 1s, 10s, 100s, and we will rounded it off to the nearest 10. We would have said that would have been 560, because this 6 still needs to be in the 10s column. So we have to fill in the 0 for the 1s. But in the decimal places, it's a little different because this 0 does not add any value. It does not change that this is in the 10th column, right? It does not change. This will still be in the 10th column if we do not put the 0. So we don't have to fill in the rest with zeros for the decimal places. So I hope that is understood, right? The next one is 3.1824. So let's look at that. Correct to 1 decimal place, 3.1824 to 1 decimal place. So the first decimal place is the number 1. And as usual, we look at the number after. If it's 5 or more than 5, we must increase it by 1. It's 8. So it has to increase by 1. So this is approximately, and we'll put the approximate sign this time. This is approximately 3.2 to the nearest decimal place, to 1 dp, right? All right. Let's look at the second example. It's 2.144 and so on to 2 decimal places. So let's look at that. 2.144 to 2 decimal places. So 2.144, and we're approximating it to 2 decimal places. So it's 1, 2, right? So we're looking at this one. Now, as usual, we look at the next number. That is less than 5, so the 4 remains the same. So that's approximately 2.14, right? We don't have to put 2.140 or anything like that because, as I said, in the decimal place realm, that 0 afterward does not change the value of what's before. So we do not have to fill it in its zeros. Just remember that. We just need to have 1, 2 numbers after the decimal point, right? All right, and let's look at the second example, 3.2556. 3.2556, 3.2556 is that, and we're looking at 2 decimal places. So 1, 2. Look at the number before. If it's 5 or more than 5, it must increase by 1. It is 5. So therefore, this 5 will increase by 1 to 6. So this is approximately 3.26. Right? And again, I keep emphasizing we don't have to put in those zeros for the decimal places because they do not add any value. They don't shift our numbers into the correct column or anything like that. So 3.26. And what I like to do, I like to say this is to 2 dp. So I put in brackets how much I have approximated it to. You know, that's just to add, you know, some clarity that this was approximated to 2 decimal places, right? So that's how we approximate or round off to the nearest decimal place, or DPs as we call them.